I'm canning some green beans today. It's not a huge batch. Usually when I do jobs like this, I like to have a full canner, a full 18 bottles if I can, but this year the green beans are coming in a little bit slow. It's going to be a slow and steady wins the race kind of season for green beans this year. I will end up with a lot, but it's just going to take a little bit more time. So I'm just going to have to be canning some small batches more often, but that's okay. Small batches go really fast, so that's one of the advantages as well. I'm just doing green beans today, but I do have another video as well, which is a mix of green beans and carrots. So if you haven't seen it yet, be sure to check that video out. And as well, if you do like the content of my channel, don't be shy, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll be notified when I put new videos out. So now what I need to do is I've just picked these from the garden. At any time when you're canning something, the quicker that you can put them in your jars, the better the quality of the product you're going to have. So I always try to get them into my jars fairly quick so I have a more nutrition-packed vegetable or food when it comes time to eat it. So what I need to do, the way that I like to do my green beans, my string beans, is you can do them different ways. You can put them in the larger bottles, like the quart-size bottles, and you can put them all long. I like to do the 500 milliliter or the pint-sized jars, just so I can fit more string beans in there. And I find that the smaller bottles, I can fit 18 jars in my canner. So maybe one comes to the other, but the smaller jars I find convenient as well, because I can just grab a jar, throw that in my lunchbox if I'm going to work, and I have a nice big portion of vegetables for my lunch. So what I'm going to be doing now is I need to wash these. I need to cut the ends off both sides of the string beans, and then I cut them in about 1.5 inch size pieces to fit inside the jars. So let's get that started. You always want to make sure to do a good job when washing your green beans, because there are always little flowers on them and sometimes some dirt if it's been raining recently. So just make sure to always thoroughly wash your vegetables before canning at any time. Once the green beans are really well washed, well, this is when I cut the ends off. So I just go through them one by one and cut the tips off. I cut off the tips on both ends, but some people actually don't mind this part. They'll leave it on and just cut off one end. I prefer to remove them both, or you don't need a knife. You can just snap these off as well. That works just as well. So basically you just work your way through all your green beans until you've got all the ends taken off. Just a little tip for you. Let me dig through my beans here. I'm going to show you something. So I have one here. So if you look at the difference between these two sizes of green beans, these probably what happened is when the green beans start coming in, I usually go into the garden every other day to pick them. But sometimes, surprisingly, it's easy to miss them. So you miss a couple, and then the next time you go, they're starting to get big. But what you do with these that are a little bit bigger, don't throw them out, because surprisingly, these green beans are really good in soups. So what I do is I start a bag, and what I find some that are just too big, I'll cut the tips off the same way, and then I just cut them up in pieces, put them in a bag, and just freeze them. And when I make a nice homemade soup, these green beans taste just as good as anything that you would put in your soup, and you don't even notice that the bean inside of there is really big. So that's what I do with those beans now that don't make the cut to go into my jars. So now I'm going to get through the rest of these. Now that I've cut off all the tips, I just need to cut them up into small pieces so they fit better in the jars. If you're unfamiliar with canning, string beans are a low-acid food. So what that means is that these need to be pressure canned, and it's the only way that you can safely preserve them is with pressure canning. So if you're unfamiliar with pressure canning, be sure to check out my video. I do have a video, a much more detailed video on how to pressure can. Now it's time to put them in the jars. It's really simple doing green beans, putting them in bottles and processing them. There's two different methods that you can do. So one is called the hot pack and one is called the raw pack. So what's the difference? If you want to do the hot pack, what you got to do is you're going to put your string beans in boiling water for 5 minutes and then immerse them in cold water. So So why would you do this extra step? What it allows you to do is it'll make your vegetables more pliable and easier to get in the bottle. So that way you'll be able to stuff more in your bottles. For me, I don't do that extra step. I find that if I pack them in really tight, I can really get a nice full jar of green beans without doing that extra step. It's all a personal preference. Do it the way you prefer. I like to try to keep things as simple as possible. Either way, they're acceptable. Just let me show you a jar of green beans that I've done recently, and I'll show you how tightly packed they are, even using the raw pack method. Let me go grab that bottle. You can see they look, the bottle looks really full. Like if I turn it upside down, I really don't have that much space at the bottom. So my jar is still really full, and I just did the raw pack. So up to you what you prefer, but just to show you how it looks, you still get a nice full bottle. So keep that in mind. Now to get these in the jars. So I have my jars warming here in a pot of fairly hot water, and it's just to get them warm, and I'm also going to be using that water to pour inside of the jars as well. And as usual, my jars were washed really well, rinsed really well, and put in the pot here just to make sure that they stay warm. And my canner is also back there warming up, so everything's nice and warm. So I always use my hands. I always make sure I wash my hands well. So when I tell you that I pack it down, I really pack it down. I push down, and you want to leave that 1 inch of head space at the top of your jar. So you're packing this down really well. So you just continue to do that until you've got all your green beans in your jars. Salt is optional. So it's somewhere around half a teaspoon per every pint-sized jar, or every 500 milliliter jar, somewhere around half a teaspoon. It's not necessary. It's not something you have to safely can. It's just a matter of taste and preference. So once you have your jars full, you're going to make sure that you're going to backfill with the water, leaving 1 inch of head space. This is just hot water. And even if it looks like I've got a little bit less than 1 inch of head space, when you're doing something like green beans, which doesn't fit in really, completely tight, it's really important to remove the air bubbles. And you're going to see, once I let the air bubbles out of the jar, that I will have my 1 inch of head space. Pack back down tight. I always like to put the salt in before adding the water. I find if I put the salt on top and then add the water, it helps distribute the salt as well. So I have my 1 inch head space. As usual, it's a low acid food. It's not meat. You wipe the rim off with water, making sure that it's clean. You want your seals, you want your caps to seal well. I got everything in this pot of water here. You center your cap and your rings. You put them on fingertip tight. And then you transfer that over to your pot. And just make your way through your jars. All right, so I have all my jars in my canner. I turned up the heat a little bit. We've got to bring this to a boil. I'm gonna put the cover on. As always, you want to check to make sure that you can see the light through this hole here. If this is moving, make sure that you get the cover on right. If ever you can't see the light through that hole, you can take something like a toothpick and just run it through to make sure that it's clear, because especially if you use it for pressure cooking. So if you use your canner to pressure cook, sometimes some pieces of food can get stuck in there. I never do, but it's always a good idea to check to make sure that all the moving parts are moving and everything's working like it should. So once you're sure everything's working okay, that the rubber seal inside is there, you just need to put your cover on and seal your pot. So we're going to bring this to a boil. So this has started to boil quite hard. The button has already come up, and I've got quite a bit of steam pressure coming out of the vent. So now we time it for 10 minutes, and this is venting our pot. So the pot has been venting for 10 minutes. So the next thing we do is to put the weighted gate on the pot. So I need to bring the pressure of my pot up to of 10 to 11 pounds of pressure because of the altitude that I live in. Make sure that you check the altitude that you live in to be sure that you're using the correct weight and the correct processing time. So we put the weight on and we bring this up to 11 pounds of pressure. And it gets a lot quieter when we do that. I'm getting close to 11 pounds of pressure. How do I know? My gauge is starting to rock. It starts to rock when it hits 10 pounds of pressure because it is a 10-pound weight. And then I watch my dial until I get to 11. If you don't have a dial, that's okay. You can just go by your weight. As you can see, it works really well because that's rocking and that's at 10, so it's right on. You want to make sure that you slowly lower the temperature because you don't want it to boil out of control. If you would leave it at your highest temperature, it would boil really too hard. So make sure to lower the temperature, always maintaining your gauge rocking and your 11 pounds of pressure. Once we're at 11 pounds of pressure or at the pressure you need to be for your altitude, that's when you start your timer. Green beans need to process for 20 minutes, so we're going to put our timer on because we are now at the right place. Now that the time is up, we need to remove the pot from the heat and just leave everything sit. We need to leave the pressure canner depressurized naturally. Don't try to force it. I've seen people run it under cold water, but a couple things can happen if you do that. First of all, you can lose your liquid inside of your jar, and it could also cause the jars to break. So really, the best thing that you can do is to turn the heat off. Carefully remove it from the heat if you can, and if you can't, if it's too heavy, just leave it there. You're better off to leave it there. You don't want to drag it across your stove, especially if you have glass, and ruin the top of your stove. And then it gets quiet. So we just let it sit. This process can take somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes, and you can even just leave it there and forget it. If you're afraid of pressure canners, at first I just leave it there for hours, and that's okay. But you want to at least leave it there until the dial goes down to 0. This button drops. So when that happens, you remove the gauge and let it sit for another 10 minutes. And after all that time is up, then you remove the cover. When you remove the cover, leave your jars in your pot, then you can take them out of your pot. You've got to follow the process. Don't rush the process. So now we wait. I have ended up with 6 pint-sized jars, and they're still sealing, and 1 half-pint-sized jar of green beans. They're pretty much all sealed already. As usual, like I always say, leave them sitting for 24 hours. Don't touch them, don't tip them, don't push on the tops to see if they've sealed. Leave them there for 24 hours. Once the 24 hours are up though, that's when you check to see that your jars are sealed. Remove your rings. Never store them with the rings on top. You want to make sure that you store them in a cool, dry, dark place. That's where you'll get the best shelf life for your product. These could last a year and beyond if well stored. Make sure to write the year on them. I think it's pretty obvious that they're green beans, but make sure that you write what year you canned them. It's always a good idea as well to keep a journal of things that you canned, how many you canned, maybe how many pounds of green beans you had, or just to help you along. If you run out halfway through winter, maybe the next year you want to do more, or if you end up at the end of the year that you've got way too much, then maybe you can cut down. So I hope you've enjoyed this content. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to check out other videos that I have on my channel, and check back again soon to see what other content I'll have coming out.